Thanks, everybody. Wonderful conference. I appreciate the invitation. Wonderful crowd. I don't know about the place. I don't know who picked this venue, but you got to up your game next time. I had an opportunity to sit through the Ignite session that just took place. It was run by, I guess the inspiration was Peggy Love. I just met Peggy. Seems like a really great gal. So thanks for, full disclosure, Peggy's my sister. So for a good number of years in my life, I was abused, and so I'm glad, Jim, you have been married to her for 55 years, or whatever. But I love the Ignite session. It really was a super way to get a thought across. I hope I can meet that standard. It was really, really well done. However, what I see taking place right now is all the displays and all the booths are being torn down, and I think I'm the only thing standing between you and beer and a beach party, so I promise I'll be brief. I want to walk through and embrace your topic, which is, thriving and embracing this thing called change, and I'll walk you through my view of that, my view as a soldier. If you don't know, I spent 30 plus years as a soldier. Then I've been in business for the last 12, 13 years. And I got to tell you, every step along that way is all about change. And if you want to reach a point, at some point where you can say, yeah, it's been okay, realize that it's never really over, but there are things you need to embrace in order to make that happen. I've got to share with you one quick story. I was at a conference just a couple of days ago. Earlier this week, I was at a conference with a bunch of financial guys, so a bunch of Wall Street types. We're sitting at a table, a big international crowd like this, which I thought was wonderful. So at lunch, they're serving wine. And so they're pouring wine, and the guy who's serving our table comes up and says, "Sir, would you like white or red?" I put my hand over my glass, and I said, "No, thank you. I have a speaking role." I'm just sitting there kind of reviewing my notes, and this young man next to me puts his head down and he goes, "I wish I had said that last week at my sister's wedding." I didn't pick at that scab. I think it went sideways when he got up to give the toast for the bride. I'm sure his father had a few words to say, saying, "Young man, look, thank you very much for embarrassing the family." Before I packed to come on this trip, let me take a step back, a little bit of my history. I was raised by women, my sister being one of them. I was raised by my mom, my aunts. My father was a soldier. He was gone a bunch. And then I married this great gal. My bride's right up front with Peggy. And we have all girls. So I've got 3 beautiful daughters. They look like their mom. So women are a constant in my life. So if you're a guy, guys who have daughters, show of hands, got it? You know that you really have a reduced role in your household, and you don't have any private space. And so my private space is this little cubby where I'm allowed to hang up clothes. And there are always some boxes in there. And the reason we have some boxes is that in my life as a child, Peggy's as well, is that we moved every 2 years. And Mom was great. When we got into a new house, we'd immediately settle. It was kind of a whirlwind. But I was always allowed to have a couple of boxes that could remain in my closet. I didn't have to then put them in the dresser drawers or something, or hang up some stuff. I could keep it in the box because Mom knew the clock was ticking and we were going to be moving, and we could just put tape around that box and it would facilitate this future move. So I've always had little boxes, and I put my children through that. They've moved every couple of years. So I'm getting ready to go on this trip, and I see this box I hadn't seen before. It's a little shoebox, and I open this thing up, and there are 3 eggs in a box and 2 rolls of $100 bills and $20 bills with rubber bands around them, and it seemed very, very odd to me. So I looked at Marty and I said, "Sweetie, what's with that?" And she said, "Oh, you found that box." I said, "Yeah, what's with these eggs?" And she said, "We've been married 41 years, all in a row. Same woman, no breaks in service, as we call it." And she said, "You've given a lot of speeches, you've thousands of speeches and presentations, and I've been present for most of those, and every time you gave a lousy presentation, I stuck an egg in the box. So I'm feeling pretty good. 3 eggs, thousands of presentations." And I said, "Well, thank you very much. That's great, sweetie, but what's with the money?" And she said, oh, every time I got a dozen, I sold them. So I hope I don't disappoint. I intend not to lay an egg. That's kind of up to me. I'll appreciate your help. My number one critic's sitting right there. Let's talk about this thing called change. If we can put the first slide up. So I saw a number of slides at the Ignite program that really kind of demonstrated this evolution that we all go through. So this is just a brief glance at that knucklehead on the left. Was when he graduated from high school. And then that's kind of what I would define the who. So the guy in that graduation outfit, with that was an actual bow tie. I tied that tie. That wasn't a clip-on. I'm very proud of that. That's how I would define my who. And we'll get into that. And then for about the next 34 years, you've got that guy in the middle. I was a soldier. And that's the what. And I was very concerned, and I was focused, like you guys are, in terms of how well I deliver every day, in terms of my competence and how I build my teams. Am I fulfilling my promise to that organization? And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then all of a sudden, you've got another transition in life. You're no longer a soldier. You're moving out. You're moving off. You're doing other things. And that's Marty and me with our 4 beautiful grandchildren. So all those daughters got married to wonderful guys. We feel blessed. They're having beautiful little babies, and things are great. But did all of that work? Did that transition work? And I would suggest I would give myself not an A. I would give myself a grade of maybe a B or a B minus, because there were some challenges, and how well you embrace those challenges. And I'll share what I call some of my scar tissue about that transition. Let me start with, and you can take that slide down. We don't need to look at that guy who needed a haircut when he was 17 years old. This is all about, as I said, this is all about transitions, and transitions are all about discontinuities as opposed to continuities. What we look at mostly is how we very elegantly pirouette from one iceberg to the other, and how masterfully we did that. We didn't get our feet wet, and we went from this one stage in life to another stage in life, but it's really about discontinuities, because there will be things that you'll have to jettison, and there will be things that you may not think you need to sustain and bring forward with you. And so that's the notion of who you are, and then what you do, and then who you are. And that's really the cycle I would describe, at least the way I view this. This notion of transition is all about how do you define yourself early on? What does that who look like? And then you just dive deeply into what you do, and what have you brought forward from that who foundation, and then what are you going to take forward? And I could share some experiences with some of my colleagues that have done magnificently. I use them as examples going through this process, and I also have some colleagues that have failed miserably, but they were immensely gifted in the what stage. And we've had conversations on a very private level that they forgot who they were. They were more focused on what they did. So the 3 themes that I want to talk about, it's you're not doing this alone. So who are the individuals with whom you have routine, tough discussions as you go through life? And how do you manage those discussions? Are you open about it? Do they push you? Do you push them? How resilient are you in those discussions? And can you embrace those changes, which we all understand we must do? And then how do you finish? I want to share some stories with you. So let me start with the very first who stage. I define that the fundamental who really is probably up until the age, that a kid with the bow tie and the long red hair. And before my hair was white, it was red. So I spent a good deal of my time in the hospital, and typical of redheads. And my mother was this beautiful brunette with these wonderfully gorgeous brown eyes and brown hair. And then 18 months after I was born, the family picture is my mother was a white-haired woman. So I think I contributed in some way to that. That very first 18 years of my life is when I defined the who. And I had some very personal relationships. You can't choose your parents, right? I think I won the lottery. I would suggest that Peggy probably thinks she won the lottery as well. Mom and Dad were in absolutely wonderful, loving couple. My dad was kind of a goofball. My mother was the disciplinarian. And my dad was kind of a figure in the house that was absent a lot because he was a soldier and he was gone an awful lot. But I had some really unique experiences with my dad, and I want to share some of those because those helped define who I am today. And I would say I don't think I go by, a moment of any moment of the day I haven't channeled my dad in some way, and I haven't channeled my mom. And I say that quite proudly. So I don't want to disappoint those folks. So here's an experience. I was, as a kid, my dad required of us, or at least he required of me. I don't know what he told Peggy. I don't know what he told our brother. But Dad had a conversation with me when I was a young kid, and he said, look, young man, you're going to play 3 sports. I want you to be physically active. You're going to play 3 sports. I said, okay, I'm all for that. What does that look like? He goes, first sport you're going to have to play is a sport that allows you to demonstrate how you know how to follow, that you know how to be a member of a team, that you need to realize it's not about you, it's about your contribution to a bigger cause. Okay? What does that look like? He says, so you're going to have to play, here's some examples. You play football, you play baseball, you play basketball, you're part of a team. You make a contribution in some way. You may not get on the scoreboard, but you've made a contribution. Okay, I got it. So the second thing, I want you to be able to play a sport that demonstrates your individual skills, because you need to be able to stand on your own 2 feet, young man. And so that kind of looks like golf. That may look like tennis. It might be wrestling. But you've got to get out there and be the person who has to be able to take the criticism individually for success or failure. Got it. So I guess I kind of have to lead and grow as an individual. And then the third thing, this was a kicker, he said, you must play a sport where you suffer pain. Oh, thanks, Dad. He said, no, you got to be able to fight through that. You've got to be able to pick yourself up and demonstrate that you can move forward, which means, you got to play football and get your head removed when you go across the center and somebody knocks you over. You got to wrestle. So when you're tied up in a knot and you're looking at the coach through one eye that's now bloody, you've got to figure your solution through that. That was a conversation my dad had, which is really all about diversity. We want you to kind of be out there and we want you to experience life. We want you to be able to make some decisions on your own. We're not going to channel you. You're going to be exposed to a bunch of stuff. But those were conversations that my dad had, and I've never shared this with Peggy. When I would come back from playing one of those sports, we kind of had a routine. I'd go upstairs, I'd jump in the bathtub. All of a sudden, within 30 seconds, my dad would come in. He'd put the toilet seat down, and he'd plop down, and he'd look at me, and he'd say, young man, I want to have a conversation. That's a pretty good way to get your attention. I'm not going anywhere. He's kind of got something on his mind. And he starts going through a few notes. He goes, I understand you were complaining about this. Don't complain about this. Your mom says you did that. Don't do that again. And oh, by the way, X, Y, Z. You have any questions? No. Okay, great. See you at dinner. Boom. Bathroom doors closed. Those were, that was my version of Travels with Charlie. It was almost like clockwork. Dad would come in and say, I want to have these conversations. These were life lessons. I didn't know they were life lessons. He knew exactly what he was doing. Then he was gone the next day for 3 weeks or a month and a half. Very, very precious. And I remember each one of those. Each one of those. So fast forward, I'm trying to figure out where I want to go to college. He encouraged us all to go to college. I thought I was going to carry on the family business. My grandfather had gone to West Point, was a career soldier. My father had gone to West Point. He was a career soldier. I was thinking about going to West Point. And my dad knew me. He had me dialed in. And he said, young man, I want to tell you something. Before you make a decision to go to West Point, I want you to understand something. 3 words. I like finishers. If you're going to start something, you better finish it. Because he knew exactly what was going to happen. I was going to get to West Point. I was going to find 1,000 things within the first day why I should depart. Why am I putting up with this? This is a hell I don't think I have to sign up for. I made the commitment every day. I like finishers. How do you finish? In this transition called life, how do you finish? You've got to define that. That was a lesson I was lucky to have. He also had an expression. He said, look, things are going to be tough out there. And so when you see a thistle, grasp it firmly. Who knows what a thistle is? I didn't know what a thistle was. And so it's one of those expressions, when the toilet seat down, hey, young man, when you see a thistle, grasp it firmly. Okay, I'll see you at dinner. And he'd close the door, and what the hell was that? And I'd go to Peggy or I'd go to Trey, and I'd say, have you had the thistle conversation? What was that about? Well, I don't know, but I had it, The point being, hey, look, if you're from West Texas, where our mom was from, Northwest Texas, you allow one thistle to grow in your yard, the rest of the yard is going to be thistles. The only way you get that thistle out of the yard is if you get it at the root and you pull that thing out. It's going to be painful. The result's going to be fine. So these conversations with my father were very, very formative for me in terms of defining who I was. Then you fast forward, and all of a sudden you're into this what stage of life. And the what stage of life is really all about your competence. How do you score points? How do you build a reputation? And there really are three aspects of this larger part of your life. There are really three aspects. What is your individual professional growth? How do you grow within your professional world in terms of defining your competence? Those individual personal skills as a leader, as an innovator. Second one is organizationally. How do you become a better leader within this organization? And your organizations are going to change. If you've managed to be in the same field all of your career, good on you. You're only going to scale up. Many do not have that advantage. And you find yourself adjusting to organizations throughout your entire life. And then the third thing is, how do you personally grow within that? So you got the professional growth as an individual leader. You got the organizational and the personal growth. So on the professional side, again, it's all about competence. Are you mastering the skills that are required for you to enjoy success? The key thing I think in that is, who are the mentors in your life so that you can define yourself as a professional? And mentors are all about your decisions on who those mentors are. There's a program in the military that when you reach general officer, the Army that I was a part of, would issue you. They'd introduce you to a mentor. They thought that made a lot of sense to them. Frankly, that was silly, because you'd be introduced to somebody who might be in your same field, it's probably been retired at that point. So you thought on paper that made a lot of sense. It didn't work at all. My mentor was somebody I really didn't know. He was certainly very competent. I thought that was great. And then guys like me went back to the Army and said, can we pick our own mentors? Because that's what it's all about. So you want to be able to choose wisely. It is all about, in that part of your life, it's all about who is helping you grow as a leader and how you define yourself as a leader or an innovator. So choose wisely your mentors. I won't go through I have 3 mentors in life, and they are each as different as night and day, but they complement me in terms of a leader, and they covered my weaknesses. At least I could acknowledge what my weaknesses are, and these gentlemen were wonderful in terms of helping me identify that and then grow as a leader. I would leave you with that thought. As you define yourself professionally, it's all about your mentors. Can you write down who your mentors are? And then on your professional side, I would say if you were to back up to that original stage of life, it probably was you absorbed what your values were, but you really didn't codify them. And then all of a sudden you're in this profession. Now your personal values and your professional values in some way need to coalesce. They need to come together. They need to converge. So I would ask, no need to show hands, but I would imagine everybody here has got a set of personal values, right? Maybe? Personal values. I've got personal values. But what I needed to figure out was, how do those personal values comport with my professional career? Because what I don't want to do is have 2 personalities. I don't want to have one kit bag full of personal values and then professional values that are different or in some way do not converge. I wanted to present to the folks in my professional life who I was on a very personal level. So I absorbed all those lessons learned as a young man, and then as I brought them into my profession for 30 plus years, I was able to bring those together. So I was able to pick mentors They helped me grow. I knew what my weaknesses were, and I was able to define what my values are. I've got a set of values. I could list them for you right now. They were my values in some way. As a child, they were my values that were refined in my professional life. I did not want to prevent or present two faces to anybody in my organization. And I routinely saw that in my professional life. The person at work was not the person at home or the person in any civilian space or personal space or social space. It just didn't work well for me because they were too divergent. That was very disappointing. I didn't want to repeat that. Let me talk about the organizational, some more on the organizational piece. I was in a briefing once. Again, I'm relying on my experience as a soldier. I was in a briefing once when a general officer, I was part of our army when we liberated Iraq, and I was a part of my last time in the Balkans. I was in Sarajevo for 2 years, mostly Bosnia and Kosovo and Macedonia, et cetera, Croatia, et cetera, during that horrible period in the late 90s when ethnic cleansing had stopped, but there were a bunch of war criminals, et cetera, et cetera. So I was a part of the effort to round up a lot of those bad people. The one thing I learned from this very senior officer who was a part of the Iraqi military, and after we were in Iraq, we needed to round up enough guys to figure out what we were going to look like going forward. A lot of mistakes were made, and I can regale you with those. I promise I won't, unless you want to have a private conversation. So one of the very senior general officers came up to me, and he said, "Be proud of your victorious army." Now, this is a guy who had spent 30-plus years in the military. On a personal note, he was very highly placed in Saddam's military. He had 5 daughters. He had idiomatic English. He spoke 4 languages, had studied in the United States. This was a friend. And he said, "Be proud of victorious armies like yours." And then he paused and he said, "They pay their pensions." Think about it. This guy had devoted his life to a profession. He was a professional soldier. He was educated. He was at the top of his craft. That came crashing down, and he literally had nothing. He had no home. He had no family. He had no country. He had no money. Yet he had spent 30-plus years of his life devoting himself to that. Organizationally, what are you doing to improve your organization? You have to own that next generation, because that next generation is going to pay your pension. So you hope you're picking the right folks to follow in your footsteps. Again, that gets back to the notion of mentorship. Who can you mentor? Who's picking you to be their mentors? Victorious armies pay their pensions. Successful companies pay their pensions and keep your livelihood in place. So you've got that obligation organizationally. And then in terms of how you grow personally, I would say two things. One is who you choose as your lifetime partner is the most significant decision you'll ever make in your life. Again, I'm lucky enough to have scored the lottery. I'm not sure, babe, how you feel, but it's been magnificent to have a brilliant, energetic, beautiful, thoughtful, wonderful person to push you, which leads me to the next point, which is who's the contrarian in your life that keeps you balanced? Who's the person that you demand whisper in your ear to say, you know, that may not be what you want to do. Or maybe that was okay, do a little bit more of that and less of this. Professionally, you have to do that as well. I'm blessed to have this on a personal level, and in my professional life, as an intelligence officer, that was my job to tell my bosses, I don't know that that's a good idea. Because my bosses would come up with these marvelous plans, and this is what we're going to do, here's what X, Y, and Z look like. My job was to poke a hole in each one of those. Because as an intelligence guy, I'm supposed to think like the bad guy, like the enemy. And I'd say, well, if you do X, I'll do this. I think we're going to have a problem. You do Y, I'm going to do this. I think you're going to have a problem. So I had to be a contrarian. That's a very tough role because you end up losing a lot of friends that way. You're the guy who's always making it difficult for everybody. But that's your role. So who in your organization has that obligation to keep you on a path that you know that's to your best advantage. So in that what stage of life, it's that level of competence that you achieve. How deep can you go on that? And then how long can you go on that? Because there are questions you have to ask yourself as you go through. So you make this transition. You're now at this next stage in life, the picture of Marty and myself and the grandchildren, yet I'm not done. I'm no longer a soldier, and I made this transition from being a kid to being a soldier to being a former soldier, yet I'm not done. So you have to take that foundational who, however you define that, and then how do you polish that? How do you modify that? How do you adapt to the new changes? How do you adapt to this new environment? You don't want to be the individual who has everything that's collapsed underneath him. Most folks, hopefully, can avoid that through good decisions that they make. Some simply cannot, like that gentleman in Iraq. But how do you adapt? How do you polish that? Because you're not finished. I heard a guy tell me once he retired, what he was interested in is two things. He wanted to, because he'd served as a soldier his entire life, he said, I need to go make some money, and I need to have time. Those two were mutually exclusive, and it didn't work very well for him. And he found himself forgetting who he was, and he went after a bunch of shiny objects that weren't so shiny. And he ended up risking it. And I got to tell you, there isn't enough money in the world to buy back your reputation. He thought he was making enough money, and he was confident he wasn't going to lose his reputation. He lost his reputation. He can't buy it back. So he went after some shiny object that wasn't as shiny once he got a hold of it. In fact, one of the Ignite presentations was, "Merd happens." Yeah, it does. It does. So don't go after all those shiny objects. And oh, by the way, he suddenly now had the time he thought he wanted. And after a couple of weeks, he had idle hands and he started digging some deeper holes for himself. So the notion of these discontinuities is very, very true. It's relevant. And you have to be able to figure out, what are you going to bring forward? Can you bring them forward? And how does that fit in these different stages of life? I must acknowledge, I hear the expression all the time, think outside of the box. My view of that, don't think outside of the box. Build a bigger box. Because if you think outside of the box, and I'm a leader within my organization, if I want folks to think outside of the box, if they're outside of the box, they're outside of the defined element that I've asked them to be in terms of authority, responsibility, and accountability, right? As a leader, I should be able to build a bigger box to let them run free a little bit more. Because I, as a leader, want to take accountability if somebody's doing something that's aggressive and taking some initiative. I don't want them to feel like they're outside of the box. Hey, man, you're outside of the box. We built a box. I've seen that a bunch. That is a combination of a discontinuity where you went from a very strong what, now you're into a who world, and you've forgotten, or at least you have individuals above you that have forgotten what their who's are all about. So it's not very complicated, certainly, but the notion of who, what, and who resonates very, very strongly for me, and has helped me during this period of multiple discontinuities in my life. Let me share with you in this next stage of life, this third stage, this second who, if you will, as it evolves. There's an expression I learned from the IDF, Israeli Defense Force. I served with the Israelis on a couple of occasions. Wonderful soldiers, magnificent nation, surrounded by people who have for over 4,000 years tried to kill them and get rid of them. They survive. You go, God, you're doing something right. In 1967, they did something incredibly right. They read some leading indicators, and they destroyed most of the Jordanian and the Egyptian military, right? They were flushed with victory. 1967, the Israelis were flushed with victory. It was phenomenal. What happened in 1973? They missed almost every leading indicator, and Israel almost was completely overrun and lost, if not for the incredible initiative of a couple 23-year-old tank commanders in the Golan Heights. It's a magnificent story. And the Israeli military came back and said, we cannot afford to do that again. I mean, Israel is a tiny little country, incredibly fragile. everybody wants us in the Mediterranean. Everybody wants us gone. So they created this notion of the 10th person. The 10th person, the role of that individual was to be the contrarian in the organization. And that role was highly, highly defined. So if in an organization of 10 people, and 9 had a certain fixed opinion about what was going to happen, it was the obligation of the 10th person to challenge those assumptions in a learned, fulsome way. That person has to be able to stand up to all of those pressures, all of those biases, all of that momentum to get into the formation and agree, because that's the easy place to be. The light doesn't shine on you. It's easy to get in that formation. You can blame it on everybody else if it goes sideways. Not when you're about to lose a nation that's survived for 4,000 years. So the 10th person is a notion that if you can embrace throughout this life of discontinuities, you're in a far better place, a far better place. Let me end, if I can, with a couple of thoughts. Essentially, there are 6 questions that you should ask yourself as you go through and you try to finish, because really you're never finished. But as you're moving down that path, they are you aligned with your partner? Do you have those tough conversations? I failed in the transition from the military to the life after the military. I really didn't, in a very fulsome way, involve my bride in those discussions. I kind of announced that I was going to go another path, take another path. And there were some personal and professional reasons why I was going to do that. I don't think I failed, but I don't think I was as true to myself and certainly as conscious of her incredible input. So are you aligned with your partner? That person who can be your personal contrarian, who can offer another idea. Secondly, are you going to keep at this, whatever this is, until somebody asks you to leave? Or is that going to be your choice? Deloitte is a wonderful company that I've done a lot of work with. Magnificent company. They have an expression: change before you have to. Make that decision before you have to. Because at some point, their phone call is going to come, or somebody's going to tap you on the shoulder. And they're going to say, love you, but it's time to go do something else. Change before you have to. That's a personal decision. You've got to be able to make that. Most importantly, what is your legacy? What are the stories that your organization, that your family are going to tell about you when you're not there? Can you write those stories right now? Do you know what they look like? You probably do. So, do you have to polish those stories, or are they in pretty good shape? Think about the stories that will be told about you when you're not in the room anymore. Are you open for new tricks? And what are the old tricks that you need to continue to embrace? You don't want to abandon it. You want to keep polishing what it is, who you are. And then clearly, are you ready for this? The answer probably is toujours prêt. You're always ready for it, because it will be on your terms. If you've thought about it, which you have, this conference has been magnificent for you to think about it. And it's not just change within your organization, it's how you are a part of that change and driving that change within your organization, within your families, how it affects you personally, etc. I'm going to leave you with a couple stories. One is, again, a military story. There is an organization in the military. You have platoons and companies and battalions. And at the battalion level is where you've been in the Army probably 20 years. You've got a vast amount of experience. You've been in a whole bunch of different assignments. And they suddenly put you in charge of maybe 600 men and women. And it's at really the top of your game, because you not only have direct but indirect leadership responsibilities. So you're not so far away that you don't touch the organization in a very personal way. It's a magnificent position. A very dear friend of mine was in command of a battalion and was magnificent in what he did to train that battalion. He then left battalion command in an orderly fashion. It was time for him to change. He had what's called a change of command, and within about 3 weeks, that battalion had to go to combat. which is the pinnacle of what it is you want to test your organization. He was no longer a part of that organization. He was gone. So on a personal level, he was thinking to himself, my goodness, I'm out doing something else, and this organization is now going to combat. The second they got back from combat, the number 2 guy in that organization wrote his former boss a letter that said, Dear Sir, the battalion did magnificently well in our initial engagement against the enemy, and we acquitted ourselves well for the duration of our time in combat. We could not have done that without you. The new guy was smart enough to embrace what he saw, and we were able to continue to drive on. Don't you want to have that type of recognition? That your legacy, that's the story you want told about you at the end of the day. I did my duty. I did it as well as I could. I'm now gone. And oh, by the way, the organization is still going extremely well. I also say, on a very personal level, the second story is, my bride's dad was killed in Vietnam. It was his 4th tour in Vietnam. He was a very senior officer. He had fought in World War II. He had fought in Korea. He had fought in Vietnam 4 times, and then he was killed. 7 kids at home from the ages of 3 to 22. My mother-in-law has a jewel in her crown in heaven when she gets there. She's 91, and she's hanging in there, and she's feisty as hell. She's beautiful. She's wonderful. My father-in-law was killed. High impact on the organization. But the organization continues to move forward because of what he was able to accomplish. Again, another note that came back saying, you did such an incredible job. We miss you. We mourn you. The military is less an organization now than it was when you were with it, but we've got work to do. He left a legacy. The stories told about him still exist. He's a magnificent guy, very tough guy when you're dating his daughter, let me tell you. And then finally, let me leave with you on a very personal level, a note that I got from a young soldier as I was retiring from the military. It says, Dear General Marks, I want to thank you for all your mentorship and support that you have shown me. I appreciate your kindness and your patience, especially when you were not particularly happy with something I had done. But you always focused on what you intended, never on my character or my person. I won't ever forget your sincere expression and honesty during particularly moving events like the Vietnam Moving Wall, the Prosser Village dedication, which was a dedication for a building where I was commanding in honor of a soldier who had just been killed in Iraq, and for the Hall of Fame induction ceremony. I've learned too much to mention in this single short letter, but mostly I've learned how I like to be treated. And that's with dignity and respect, no matter how simple or complicated the task. More than anything, I am grateful for your trust in my ability to get things done and your encouragement. Nothing is more empowering to a junior officer, and I thank you for that. Take care. My thoughts and prayers are with you. Very respectfully, Lieutenant Elliot Olmsted. That's the letter you want to get when you're at the end of this or you're trying to define what finishing looks like. Although I give myself a less than an A grade, this is an A letter, and I'm feeling pretty good about it. So thank you for your time. If you've got any questions, I'll be glad to entertain them. Thanks.